Our next presentation will be from Ronald Miles from Binghamton University, University of Binghamton. Sorry, Binghamton University. The next presentation will be from Ronald Miles from Binghamton University on how spiders use their webs to hear. Sorry about that.
Campus has lots of names. So. Okay, thank you. So this story is actually kind of related to what Paula was talking about in the sense of going out and observing nature and listening to nature. This is ultimately about how sometimes everyday objects can tell you a lot of really interesting things. So it's not so much about listening to it, but so many of us have seen insects and things like this. Maybe you haven't seen them up close, but if you ever can look at them up really close, you'll see that they're covered with hairs, a lot of them. And many of these hairs are actually for sensing sound. So in this case, this is the head of a mosquito, and on the mosquito, so this is blown up rather a lot. I'm not talking enough. Okay, sorry. I will try to get closer. So this structure is actually the ear of the mosquito. It hears because when sound comes, it causes air to move, and that air motion puts forces on this structure, and it makes it move back and forth in the sound field. So there's lots and lots of animals that hear this way. This is a picture of a cricket, and at the back end of a cricket, there are little tiny hairs, and these hairs respond to sound. There are just countless animals, mostly insects, that hear this way, and you often don't think about it at all. But if you dive in and look closely, you can learn something. So how is it that sound causes these things to move? Humans hear sound because we know sound pressure acts on our eardrum and makes the eardrum move. These hairs don't really get driven by pressure. It acts all around them. What's driving them is the motion of the air and the viscous property of the air. So air has viscosity. And if you look at the little particles in the air, these are molecules, they're all zooming around really fast, so there's this random motion of these particles. And if you create a sound field by having a piston at one end of a tube, say, you'll see the density of these particles propagates to the right. And also the sound pressure propagates to the right. But if you track the motion of individual particles, and I've got a little red dot here indicating one of those particles, it's moving back and forth. So if you can track the motion of these particles back and forth, you're also sensing the sound. And that's actually what the insects are doing. So because, I don't know, I've been interested in acoustics and how to sense sound and things like that, I was just wondering, how can we create a device that kind of works this way? How could we check this out experimentally? So I was looking for some fine fibers. I thought maybe I couldn't really make an insect hair, but if I could get some fine fibers and support it on each end, we could play sound and measure the motion of the fiber in response to sound and learn something about how the fiber moves. And actually, some of the earlier work on this kind of problem was actually done by Stokes in a famous paper in 1851, which I read and was kind of mind-blowing. But he works out the forces that act on these thin things. And so I did some calculations, and I was telling my student, you know, I'd really like to get something very much finer than these fibers. We measured them, and they do respond to sound, but according to the theory, they needed to be thinner and lighter than the fiber we found. And by the way, the fiber we found was kind of difficult to find. I got on the internet and I contacted a vendor for some fiber that was, I think, 10 microns in diameter, and I thought, this is great. And he said, yeah, we have some, I'll send it to you. And I said, how much? And he said it would be $10,000. And so I said, thank you very much, and I went on the internet some more, and I found Blue Barn fiber on Etsy, and I got a bag of this stuff for $15, which was great. So we tested that, and it matched reasonably well with the theory, but I told my student, we'd like to get finer fibers, and so he contacted some friends in chemistry, and they were electrospinning plastic fibers, and we tried that. It was very fragile. And then, this is the nature part, this student likes to go for walks in our campus nature preserve. So he went for a walk in the nature preserve and he noticed a spider web, and the spider web was blowing in the breeze. And so he thought maybe we should use spider silk. So he borrowed a spider from the nature preserve, brought it to the lab, and figured out a way to harvest silk from the spider. He would get it to fall and he would roll up the silk, and we put the silk in front of our laser vibrometer to measure its motion in our fancy anechoic chamber, and we were able to measure how well this silk responds to sound. And we could compare it to some other things, but this is a plot of the motion of the silk relative to the acoustic motion of the air in a sound field as a function of frequency from 1 hertz to 50 kilohertz. So it's a log plot, and the blue line is what we got for this spider silk. Basically, it moves just as much as the air does over a frequency range from 1 hertz to 50 kilohertz, which is better than any microphone ever has done or ever will, probably. In addition, we've also plotted here the relative, velocity relative to the air of the cricket, those little hairs that I showed you on the cricket. And then below that is the best current human-made velocity sensor. Not very good in comparison to spider silk. And so we kind of worked out the theory for why this happens. The spider silk is driven by the viscosity of the air, which is kind of a strange notion that air is viscous, kind of like honey. But when you put a really tiny object in the hair, for reasons that are strange, it experiences a lot of viscous force. And in fact, if you observe dust floating around in the air, it's hanging there largely because the air is viscous. If there were no viscosity, it would drop to the ground. So the viscosity of the air is important. So spiders taught us to think about sensing flow this way, and this raised a question. So we felt like we understood something about how silk could respond to sound, but it raised a question. The silk is made by the spider for its web. So how does the web move, and can the spider detect the motion of the web because of the sound-driven motion of the web? And so we used our laser vibrometer and made 1,000 measurements over various locations on a spider web when the spider web was driven by sound. And this image shows, an animation of the data that we obtained during that measurement. And this is the spider who provided us with the inspiration. So the spider web can move in response to sound. This is going to raise another question. If the individual silk responds to sound, the whole spider web can respond to sound. What if a spider is sitting on the web? Can it hear that sound-induced motion of the web? Now, some spiders have their own little ears, but not all spiders do. And so we thought maybe we should study, can the spider hear with this sound-induced web motion? since the spider is very good at detecting the motion of the web with its feet, maybe it could do that. So I have some videos. Also note that we took a lot of care to make sure that the input to this system was sound that was traveling in air. So hopefully this is going to work. So the spider is sitting in a very quiet space in the dark, and then we play a sound. They do nothing without the sound. Sometimes the response is small, but sometimes if the sound is coming from one side, the spider turns toward the sound, which shows that the spider can actually localize the sound that's being played. It can detect the relative motion using all of its 8 legs, and it's getting information from the motion of its web, which is kind of odd. So I'm not a biologist, I'm just an engineer, and so I'm kind of obligated to try to figure out what this means for making things. And one thing that strikes me is that microphones, which are kind of everywhere these days, they're also kind of inspired by nature, because about 150 years ago, we were learning how the human ear works. We found there's an eardrum inside. There's sensory cells and all this stuff to connect the eardrum to the brain, and this is how you hear. And the eardrum is sensing pressure. And then folks like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell and all the other inventors of the microphone decided to make microphones that basically have essentially the same structure. They have a diaphragm and then some stuff inside to turn the motion of the diaphragm into an electronic signal. So it's really a bio-inspired device. But since then, again, for around 150 years, essentially all microphones are designed to sense just pressure, just the pressure component of the sound field, not the motion. And I also have a claim that basically engineers are inspired by biology all the time, whether they know it or not. So in the case of a microphone, it really is a biomimetic design, but the observation of insect hairs and spider silk and spider webs and spiders hearing using the motion of their web suggests that we should at least have a look at how to detect sound using the motion of the air. And it's really been terribly understudied. So anyway, I think that's all.
Thank you so much, Ron. Now we have time for some questions. So I'll start us out with a question, not to put you on the spot, but what do you see as a spider silk inspired microphone to look like? Would it look like this, or would it be something a totally different shape?
Yeah, the microphone. So that is a complex question, actually. It turns out that to sense flow, we know so little. Again, because for 150 years we've been sensing pressure. No one has been sensing flow, hardly, just a few people. And there's a lot to learn about how exactly to do it. So there is an issue, an important issue, that we've actually addressed in a paper that came out last month in the Journal of the Acoustical Society, just to put it in an ad, where we address an issue having to do with flow sensing microphones versus pressure sensing microphones. So the issue has to do with the noise in the microphone. And it turns out that spider silk is kind of noisy. It's kind of noisy. And you measure that we've done a lot of work on just the mechanical thermal noise of the device. And spider silk, because of its properties, it tends to pick up the random motion of the air molecules almost as well as the sound. It tends to be kind of noisy. You have to play the sound pretty loud in order to get a good signal. So how do you make a low noise flow sensing microphone? And so we have a recent paper on that subject, so you can look it up. But it should generally look like any other microphone. I mean, in the end, with enough engineering work to make it correct, it's not going to look terribly different. And it could be made using silicon microfabrication, which is the way almost all microphones are currently made.
So 10 years from now,
Yeah.
it will look like the same mic.
It's not there yet.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions from our online audience? Okay, Wendy.
Yes, we have a few questions. One is, how long would it take to produce and manipulate enough spider silk for a standard microphone?
I am not proposing that we harvest spider silk to make microphones. This is not a practical way to make a microphone. And you could do it if you just wanted one or two, but the way microphones are made now, typically, is they use silicon microfabrication. So they're made using silicon wafers. Those are the microphones that are in your cell phone. Billions of microphones are made every year that way. And so our research has been about how do you learn from the silk or from the animals in order to make a silicon-based microphone that is fabricated using the usual sorts of techniques. And that's kind of how what our recent paper is on. So small, and silicon is a good material to make a microphone out of, but you have to have the right design. I think that might answer the question. Okay.
It does. And then can you share what species of spiders were observed for this study?
That's hard. Again, I am not a biologist. It's in our papers. So we have 2 papers in PNAS on this, which you can find if you Google Scholar my name, probably. But I don't remember their names, honestly. Sorry. Well, actually, I don't remember their real name. They're called, locally, they're called bridge spiders. They're very common. For some reason, these spiders like to hang out on bridges. And they make their webs around structures, human structures. So bridge spider, but that's not a real name. You know, that's just a...
We'll take it.
Okay.
And how was it working with the spiders? Did you learn a lot about the safest way to handle them, the best way to prep everything to get, good results?
Spiders are a challenge sometimes to work with. It is quite safe to work with these spiders, though some might question that. They don't bite. They're not dangerous. They're not, black widows or anything. They, however, there are people who are afraid, and I must admit that my graduate student is terrified of them. He never quite got over it. I don't know if he'll ever be the same, but I'm sorry about that. But these spiders, to work with them was partly a challenge because we wanted to study the acoustic motion of their web. So how do you go gathering up a spider web? It's not easy. And my hat's off to my students who figured out a way. What they found was, in our building, there's these windows, big windows, and they leave the lights on at night. The lights on attract insects to the windows. The spiders aren't stupid. They put their webs on the windows where the insects are buzzing around, and they catch them. So my students then put these wooden frames on the windows, and the poor spiders came, put their webs on the frames. Then in the morning, my students would go and harvest the spider webs with their frames, bring them to the lab. So in the pictures, you saw a wooden frame around the spider. That was where it came from. So handling them is tricky. It takes a lot of ingenuity. But they're not dangerous, you know, but a lot of people are afraid of them.
I can relate to that. And that was very clever. So what do you see for the future of your research? What comes next?
We are, I have to keep this short, but there's a lot. So a lot of work should be done in order to make the idea of sensing flow a engineering possibility. There's just a lot of engineering that has to be done in order to create a device that is robust, that you could put in your cell phone, that you can fabricate cheaply. And there's a million engineering questions to answer about how to do that. The truth is, and I'll try to keep this really short, we currently are working on a project to sense acoustic flow, the motion of the air within the human ear canal. And this is funded by the National Institutes of Health. And the purpose of this is to do a better job of measuring the sound that is emitted by the ear, coming out of the ear. You want to be able to measure that. And why is there sound coming out of the ear? I thought it went the other way. Sound comes out of the ear after you play a sound. The sound drives the eardrum. The eardrum moves all the stuff inside the ear, sends a signal to the brain. The brain goes, hey, I hear something. And then the brain sends a signal back to the ear. And it messes with the ear and ultimately can cause the eardrum to move. The motion of the eardrum makes sound, and it's called an otoacoustic emission. If you can measure that sound, you learn that the ear is actually working. If you get no sound at all, the ear is probably not working. And so it can tell you a lot about the insides of the ear, which are hard to study. So we are currently funded by NIH to develop this device for the purpose of measuring these otoacoustic emissions. And by measuring both the flow and the pressure, you can do a better job than what's done now. So it's a really long story. I hope that's short enough. But anyway, that's one of the things that we're doing. There's a lot of other stuff that needs to be done in order to turn the whole idea into something useful. Okay?
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ron. That was really fascinating.